All right, welcome everybody. It's good to see everybody back here. We're safe here in a brand new room. We got a very, very generous audience here tonight. And what a night to be here, because we're going to be going a little off track here. This might sound a little daring, it might sound a little vulgar, but I think it's relevant, especially for the current culture war that we are surviving in. So last week, quick recap, we talked about, well, basically the hippies seem to have their thing going. And when we talked about bio-Leninism in journalism, bio-Leninism in the 70s, people that are usually not in influential positions get more and more gigs as professors in academia, and they became visible in the public space. People like Nixon and Enoch Powell were removed from office due to unelected, unqualified, honestly, personalities that drove a wedge between the people and their representatives. So how does something like that happen? How do these personalities develop in a climate that only just recently experienced the civil rights movement? So that was the 70s. We've covered the 70s, and we're going to be switching gears here. In our next slide, it's actually about one more slide. We're going to be getting into one of our, that's relevant too, but we'll go on to the next one. You know, we might feel as Zoomers here in the audience, we might feel like we're very schizophrenic. We might feel like American identity is a little too malleable, and it's caused us to have some Twitter fights. It's even caused maybe some friendships to collide. And so I'd like to address some of those concerns with today's speech. And last week, we gave some kudos to our good buddy, Catherine D., who is a writer, journalist, Twitter space poster, if she can figure it out. But Catherine D. is somebody who talked about, when we're looking at identity, she covers a lot of online culture, online history, and she talks about the before and after the digital age. Some millennials and Gen Xers, even if we got some complaints on other fronts, one thing that they do remember is the fact that what it was like before the internet. And even some people our age are a bit at a disadvantage because we don't seem to have that same point of reference. If anything, we gotta hurdle over and try to check out things, go backwards in retrospect. And so it's a bit daunting, but people like Catherine D. are putting in the work, and she's a millennial, which is the theme for the speech. We're going to be giving the millennials a thumbs up this go around, maybe not permanently, but I think it's going to take millennial voices to drive Zoomers out of modernity. So that's Catherine D. And I think in the next slide, we're going to be talking about our next. Oh, okay. Well, actually, that's actually more relevant. The other source we'll be using, shout out to Gio Benechetti, an Italian force of nature, podcaster, Hungian, futurist, among other titles. He has a very insightful video talking about Hyperculture, which is a book by Byung-Chul Han, who is a philosopher who talks about the digital age and some of its shortcomings. This kind of gels very well with the next person we're going to be talking about. But basically, his thesis, Hans, is how the internet has created an artificial identity, a synthetic identity that basically keeps people online. And even though the internet is supposed to globalize everything and keep us all connected through internet discourse, it actually isolates us. And I think a lot of people here can relate to the fact that if you're really into something obscure, we're going to be getting into geek culture and even some hipsterdom if you're a part of those groups. But really, when we look at people that are really interested in something, it's not so much a whole identity. It's a lot of hobbies. Even if it's a collage of hobbies, these are still hobbies. These are not something that fulfill a person's identity. And so I think it's important to realize that the internet isolates us insofar as it keeps people chasing for something that is not going to make us whole. And so that's the kind of thing that we'd like to raise awareness of, because I think a lot of people think if everybody's online, then we're, holding hands across the world, literally, but actually we're even more isolated than before. And then the other factor that is isolating us even further is going to be our next slide. This is Louis. I'm sort of in the way, but that's all right. We're talking about Louise Perry, who just put out a book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And I know we've talked in glowing terms about Phyllis Schlafly. She is sort of continuing that legacy, albeit from a less conservative position. But her thesis in her book is basically talking about how the sexual revolution survived second wave feminism. And a lot of people might just see it as one long slug, one long civil rights movement that just keeps extending, asking for more, having a more militant personality. But she looks at a lot of the terms that were popular just in the 60s. And she talks about the fact that a lot of sex really got into the hands of men. And so if feminists want to live in a world that is based on consent and consent alone, they're going to need something more than that to have a proper perspective on sex and sex ethics. So that's something that she brings up a lot. And so there's a bit of a theme here. When we talk about millennials, we think about the internet. We're as Zoomers, even though we're tech savvy, even though we can help out some of the boomers, we'd like to think that we have that drive, not sex drive, but just a regular general drive that we can manage our way on the internet. But when we look back at the sexual revolution, we can find sort of the roots of third wave feminism that was prevalent during the 90s. And so millennials, I would like to say, are veterans of the culture war, and their experience on the internet is going to be more helpful even than Zoomers, because Zoomers, I think, kind of have their blinders on when they talk about these topics. A lot of them became slaves to apps like, or websites rather, of Tumblr. And then sort of on the female side, and then on the male side, you see things like 4chan, you see things like YouTube and Twitter comment sections. That is sort of the counterpart to the female personalities. There's also, it's kind of the opposite thing happening in male spaces. And so also Louise Perry, she talks a lot just about, hookup culture. It's unsustainable, doesn't make people happy. I don't think most of the people in this room need to hear that pitch, but it kind of goes with the territory that when you have the internet, it's going to accelerate the sexual revolution, and it's going to exacerbate a lot of the norms and customs that a lot of young people are going to be facing during high school too, during their developing years. So I think we'll switch back here. All right, I think in our next slide. So what are some of the obstacles that we're facing? What are the things what is the hippie legacy that is still surviving in the 21st century? That seems like ancient history, but we're still dealing with it. So what's going to be the way to get through it? Well, there's certain ideas that keep the hippie legacy alive, even legacies that some conservatives seem to defend. A lot of people, like we talked last week about how American conservative identity is very strange. You have some individualism, you have some authoritarianism, people seem to want democracy all over the world. It's sort of a kind of like a colonial project in the 21st century. It's also online. So the internet is also a force. And so it's just a big hodgepodge. And what exactly is the consistent identity with all of that? Some would argue there isn't. Some people, including people we've talked about, Academic Agent, have said that it's baked into the cake that Americans are going to have a schizophrenic identity. They're going to have to sort of try to have it all ways, even if it doesn't work. That's just the American perspective. But I would like to argue that there was an identity prior to the 1960s, prior to the sexual revolution, that was consistent. And we talk about that with Elvis. We talk about that with gospel singers, the fact that we haven't gotten too much into gospel in general, but the fact that you had a religious personality, you had something that was a bit more virtuous. And what we're seeing today is people want to combine that with modernity. But as we said last week, I think going back to pre-modern standards is going to be a positive development. We don't have to reconcile these two things. We just have to segregate them as personalities because they are very different. So I just thought in my head, if this was muted this whole time, I was about to go ballistic. But thankfully, we are doing very well. So I see some people having a good time in chat. We love it, and we're enjoying that. So one of the main obstacles, something I mentioned also last week, we talked about Jordan Peterson's, one of his recent videos that's been making waves. He talks about his conservative manifesto. And, we like some of what Peterson talks about. We think directionally, he's basically going in a positive direction. One of the things we'd like to be a little more outspoken about is the fact that he talks about that John Stuart Mill philosophy we mentioned before, and that is individualism. As Gio talked about when he was going over Han's hyperculture book, the fact that people today in the digital age, they see themselves as pure potential. If you had to narrow down, what is the Zoomer identity? What is someone who is terminally online? What are the things that you hear from boomers and Gen Xers? You guys are too much on your phones. What is the real downside to somebody like that? Is it a lack of social skills? Yes. Is it using that as a substitute for spending your time doing something that could develop into a skill, develop you intellectually, physically? Yes, those are also problems. But I think ultimately a lot of people are not thinking about who they are and where they stand. And that's why during election seasons, people kind of go all over the political spectrum. I'm sure people have heard horror stories of people that go from far left circles to far right circles and everything in between. And people go on Tumblr and they get in these niche networks, which we emphasize a lot. And those networks create identity. The reason why friend groups and friend networks seem to outcompete a lot of family-based networks is because the friend ones are the ones that are online and they're more tech savvy when talking about the language, the discourse. That's something that the parents, even all these years later, I mean, we've had the internet for like over 20 years and they're still not totally tuned in. And so it takes a millennial perspective. It takes Catherine D. Perry and a number of other voices to show people here, here's how we're painting by the numbers. Here's where the evolution, here's the art that people are having. And I think to most older folks, a lot of it is just very confusing and overwhelming, but it's actually very easy. Some people even do it for fun, kind of projecting a little bit there. But one of the main problems with seeing yourself as this identity is pure potential. It's not local. You got to have a local culture. And one of the problems with technology in general, I don't know if we want to totally condemn technology as something that is purely neutral, but certainly the way that it is weaponized today is not. We're seeing a lot of technology, supporters, spokesmen, however you'd like to call it. A lot of them think it's a given that we have people online and people having no sense of history, kind of removing themselves from family, kind of wedding themselves to these online networks exclusively. That is something that we don't want for Generation Z. We'd want them to kind of, if it might be a little painful to kind of talk to Gen X and millennials. Hopefully they don't hold too much of a grudge after all the things we've said. But I think it's very important to have a pre-modern identity. That is something that is going to be long-term because a lot of these trends that people get hooked up with online, not only is it going to make people unhappy, it's not going to be sustainable. So those are some of the main critiques with that one. And then in our next slide, I think we got the Wojak slide, which we're enjoying that. Some people might not even know what this is, and that's kind of one of the main problems. Many people assume that there wasn't a shift somewhere along the way where people's values were encouraged to go in one certain direction and then away from others. Why is that? People say that that's the American perspective. Like we said, Academic Agent talks about this heavily, the fact that, when you see the culture war in such a bad state today, it was always inevitable for that to happen. Some people want to separate the sexual revolution from the 60s, the civil rights influence on the 60s. People say, well, that was the natural course that was going to happen inevitably. So you can't really complain. Conservatives can't really complain that is part of the diet, that is part of the personalities. But I'd like us to kind of readjust that diet and look at something a little more fulfilling, something pre-modern. And so when we look at the 90s, this is kind of the main decade. If we talked about the 70s and how the bio-Leninist class, the pundit class, they kind of had their way in the 70s, taking out public officials and then dominating in the culture war. In the 90s, you really got to see that accelerated. And that might sound very confusing to a boomer, Gen Xer. People might say, by the time we get to the 90s, we're done with World War II, long done. We won the Cold War, a war that encompassed Gen Xers and boomers. And so, but then you look at film during that time and how do they depict 90s workplace life? They depict it as boring. They depict life after, without any wars, without any, anything to not fight for. I mean, I understand that, but they act like the American identity outside of war has no isolated identity. It doesn't have anything distinct. But I disagree with that. We should have seen people like celebrating the death of atheism with the fall of the Soviet Union and the fact that the Cold War was not something that had to be in our public psyche. And then just imagine if people applied that same standard to the post-war era in the 1940s, if people were still not satisfied with the fact that they had just gotten out of a war. Or think about how people, even in schools, they talk about the Roaring 20s. That was supposed to be a celebratory time. But for some reason, at the end of the century, we're supposed to think that we're supposed to, I don't know, we're supposed to fill the void with something, and eventually that got filled with more warfare. But does it have to be that way, or is that just bad political directions that happened in the course of the 90s with some administrations? But many people might ask, what changed? What changed between the people that were satisfied after a war, satisfied after kind of living to their potential after warfare in the 40s and the 20s? It was the climate. We're talking about a completely different demographic, and there was a different personality. You had people that had a foundation. They had things like religion, family, and something to fall back on. A lot of people today don't have that to fall back on. A lot of people today kind of put all their eggs in one basket. And when they look at, I mean, if World War III were to happen today, the joke is that a lot of people would not be able to cope with it because they don't have something stable, something sustainable. And instead, they try to fill it with things like, sex, drugs, and a lot of social media trends that go in and out of fashion. So I think that's the difference when we see these two different American identities. One could definitely cope even during the worst conditions, stuff like the Great Depression. Today, I think it's easy, or maybe not easy is the right word, but I think it's possible to survive the 21st century, but you would have to have a pre-modern identity. And so you would kind of have to be in tune with that. I think our next slide is going to be, yes. Okay. So talking about identities, this, I don't think this picture on the left, unfortunately, I don't think it happened. But one of the things you find, this might sound like a random point, but I mean, it's true. The fact that even in the 21st century, you did have local culture. You still had some semblance of a family unit. And when we talk about the goth girls in glowing terms, the thing is, that was sort of a different demographic than when we talk about the goth girls that are very much at the receiving end of the culture war in today's times. We see a lot of this, we see people argue it's a fourth wave of feminism. And some people might say that that's not really true because we're still kind of going through modernity. We haven't really seen, what's it really going to be like in the age of porn, in the age of Generation Z. We don't know exactly where they're going to be headed. It's too early to call. So all the research that goes into it, it's futile. But I disagree. I think if you use a pre-modern standard, we can see exactly where these things are. We saw this with the flappers in the early 20th century. We see this with a lot of decadent cultures, cabaret culture, jazz culture, which I think that's probably the one thing I can criticize aside from some of the other things that people argue. Some argue that jazz has always been subversive. It has no place in American culture. I wouldn't go that far. I think it is part of American culture, even if some people might want to say that it is inherently subversive. I think it's very all over the place, and it's very much separate from modern American identity. I think jazz is something you can narrow down. You can find something that's wholesome about it. But anyways, the thing about, to bring it back to the slide, what we see is throughout the 20th century, we see a lot of young people are at the behest of a lot of social media trends. One of them is, Hot Topic, goth, etc., alt girl, alternative stuff. But a lot of these identities are malleable. And if you don't preserve some of that local culture, then you are going to get stuff like this. You're going to see a perversion. You're going to see sort of the musical, not just musical, modern musical take on a lot of these trends. And we can't allow that. This is a personality that is being subverted. People should be outraged. There should be walkouts in the middle of high schools. And I don't understand, there was a lot of riots in the 60s, a lot of riots in the 90s for the culture war. Where are the goth girl riots not defending their own identity? Isn't that the one thing that they seem to have pride in, if nothing else? So very disappointed that the goth girls are not turning out. But I guess we'll just have to wait. Maybe Generation Alpha can give us something substantial. But very disappointing that our Zoomers are falling short. I don't think we would get this kind of flack from the millennials, frankly. I think you would be hard-pressed to find people who didn't see a distinction between the two. They would even make a distinction between the emo scene. Do Zoomers have any pride in seeing the distinction between those two? I don't think you're going to find that, unfortunately, because people are not rooted. They're just floating online. That's Han talks about the fact that we have a bunch of groups online, but it's not collectivist, which is a very pre-modern identity. We have a bunch of individuals. He calls it the swarm. You have people online that just hop from trend to trend, and people are familiar with that vaguely. But as an identity, if that's how people see themselves, how they see themselves when they go to bed, when they wake up, That's not sustainable. You got to have a population that can fill that void with something outside of the internet, outside modernity. And it just seems like a lot of people are not even engaging on stuff like that. So I think that would be a focus point that people can have moving forward. So, okay, looking at my notes, I got Goth Girl. Okay, what are we at next? I think the next slide, another example, just in case, the Goth thing is, it's overwhelming to a lot of people. Some may not find their roots in that, and so it might be a bit of an arbitrary example. But I think one that could maybe be a lot more closer to home is the geek culture. I think, I mean, this might be a controversial take, but I think the Big Bang Theory is responsible for kind of destroying the geek culture and making it mainstream. And it made it normal so that everybody was a geek. But as academic agent has said, once the geek sort of goes beyond the margins, he is no longer a geek. That's sort of antithetical to the whole identity. But because we live in the modern age and we have television accelerating the culture war, there is not that distinction. You don't have a distinction between goth and emo. You don't have a distinction between what was it like to be a geek in the 80s versus what it is today. It's a completely different thing. And older folks, even some millennials who aren't that old, if I'm being a little charitable, I think that they understand that dynamic. But a lot of people today, they just say, you know what, we've had updated musicals on Valley Girl, we've had updated musicals on Heathers and so on. It's all one big thing. We're just continuing the legacy. You know, we got to give the young people some semblance of the past. But again, we're not really giving them the identity of the past. We're just giving it to them as a product. We're giving it to them to something to consume. And there is no reference point. There is no context for why they're liking it. It's just another shapeless product. And that's something that Han criticizes, is the fact that culture doesn't work like that. You don't conduce it into something valuable. You don't put it in the hands of an individual, because we're not individuals. We can trace back identity to something specific, and we're going to have to do that moving forward. But if we're just going, like, to go off of this example, I mean, not to go off on the Red Letter Media brand, I'm very supportive, sympathetic to it. But Mr. Plinkett, as a concept, was supposed to be an online identity. He was supposed to stay there. But Mike himself, who is, among other people, Rich Evans, among others, sort of the inspiration or sort of the real life manifestation of that character, he ceases to be the geek if he's having a successful YouTube channel, has a lot of fans. That is antithetical to the geek culture. The geek culture is supposed to be local, it's supposed to be underground, and as soon as you put that in the mainstream space and you sort of, there's a movie, I think it's called Suburbia, with Penelope Spheres, feminist director. She talks about how punk rock culture kind of got all over the place. And how does that make any sense? Isn't punk rock culture supposed to be underground? But people say, well, you know, I like seeing my stuff everywhere. And so I'll put aside the philosophical questions later, and I'll just embrace this moment of cultural celebration. But no, we're going to have to do some of the messy work, and that includes narrowing down these different identities, because they're different. They're completely different. And if we don't have narrow definitions that are exclusive, then we cease to have a culture at all. We cease to have an identity at all. And so that's the Red Letter Media rant for you guys. What else do we have here? What's next on the agenda? Okay. And just some other examples here. You guys probably heard, but Edward Snowden recently caused some outrage because he got his Russian citizenship. And I think during the same week, Putin was he was conducting a draft for people that were eligible to fight in the Ukraine war. And you had a bunch of people, I mean, I didn't verify, but you have like American adjacent identities cheering this on and saying, you know, I'm going to take a stake out here in this culture war. I have an opinion on this specific thing. But why do people think like that? Why do people instinctively, they hear something on TV and it's part of their personality, it's another thing that they consume and that they feel very strongly about? Why do people have that if it's not something that they're really well read on? All right, what do we got? Oh, so it's because we're living in an extension of the people that were in charge back in the 70s. We have a pundit class very similar to the one in the 60s. You had people like Betty Friedman, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. You had people that ran magazines like Gloria Steinem for Miss Magazine. You had a pundit class that sets the standard for the culture war. And then you have everybody else who are largely just sort of lost, trying to figure things out, and they will reference the pundit class. And so why do we go so harsh on people like Jordan Peterson? Are these the worst people to walk the earth? Certainly not. But we're talking about a personality that develops through the pundit class. And so there's a relationship there that I don't think a lot of people are privy to, but that relationship is key to how opinions shift, how we get some things are normalized. For instance, in American conservatism, it was perfectly normal to have somebody that would vote for Governor Wallace. It would be perfectly reasonable for someone to vote for President Nixon. But today, a lot of those things are past the Overton window. That's kind of seems like a bygone era. But why is that? You know, going back 50 years, there's people still alive from that era. Is that a sustainable standard where the Overton window is constantly shifting to appease a pundit class, a group of journalists who aren't even elected, by the way? So I think those personalities that normalize certain like establishment approved people and sort of acting as gatekeepers that are excluding a lot of voters, excluding a lot of people that have normal, well-adjusted lives. I think it's important to have a population that still has some pre-modern views and doesn't just totally conform to the latest trend. And I think we have one of our last examples here. Oh, because there's a very insightful debate hosted on Unheard, which is a right-leaning outlet, and it was between the millennial I cited earlier, Perry, and this OnlyFans girl who was talking about she was trying to make the case for the sexual revolution in the digital age, saying, you know, there's not enough research to really condemn it fully. We have to wait for this course to pan out. And of course, Perry is arguing that there's not really much to there's not much to wait for because we've already seen it played out. We've seen people that are unhappy, and it's making people not fulfilled in their identity. But one of the things that Perry mentioned in her book is she talked about Marilyn Monroe and how even something like that, her movies were very daring during that time. And people might think it's very strange that somebody like Hugh Hefner could emerge out of the 50s. I thought we had to wait till the 1960s to get activism of that sort, to get sexual norms questioned in a very hostile way. But as she talks about in her book, you know, the Playboy legacy, the Hugh Hefner archetypes, that is something that is encouraged in the early stages of the sexual revolution. And so when you have customs, when you have sex looked through as in a very modern way, in a very 1960s way, and it's all based on consent, you know, at that point, as Perry argues, there's really nothing stopping a feminist from not accepting sex from her boss. If it's all just going to be this commodity, if sex is nothing more than consent between two adults, is that really the kind of world that a lot of people are going to be satisfied with? I think a lot of feminists would have a problem with something like that, but it just goes to show you, obviously not all men are going to do something like that. Not a lot of men are going to have the Hugh Hefner personality, but when you welcome in a culture that challenges sexual norms, you can expect stuff like that to happen. And so you cannot reconcile pre-modern views with the sexual revolution. It's going to have to be one or the other. And so some people are making their choices and they're going to have to live with the consequences. So I think we're, I think we can go on to our next one. So, as I've stated, I hope that wasn't too rambly, but since the main focus here is having Gen Z with pre-modern views, not totally conceding to modernity, one of the things that came up in the last week or so ago, Peter Thiel, who we've talked about, he's sort of the latest Howard Hughes figure, maybe the latest Vince McMahon figure to kind of accelerate the culture war. He is funding a lot of candidates that people are aware of, Blake Masters, J.D. Vance, some people that we like, some people that look pretty good. But one of the projects that Peter Thiel is behind is this new dating app. It's called The Right Stuff, which is funny. But one of the things that this dating app, as Catherine D has written up about, he talks about how the problem with dating in the 21st century is not that we need a hub where people can find conservatives on a specific app. I think there is something a lot more deeper happening in the culture war that we're going to have to look out for, and that is the identity within. People are going to have to rethink how are they going to have reasonable expectations for men and women before they can even worry about which app they're going to find their future spouse with. So I think what this app really misses is sort of the role that technology has in sex, love, etc. This is not something that is really necessary at this point. Another app that is conceding to people that want to meet online. I think we've seen enough of stuff like this, and it really doesn't get at the heart at what do men and women really expect from one another, and what do they want in a relationship? It's not going to be this narrow list of GOP approved talking points plus Tinder. I think that would be a ridiculous assumption to make. So I think we're winding down here. Do we have any remaining slides? I'm not totally privy. Okay. So I think that was TRS. And so there's a referendum happening in the culture war. And the fact that Zoomers are a part of it, and it's not like, millennials are kind of helping us do some of the work here. But I think when you see Zoomers dissatisfied, there's going to be that alliance between the millennials and the Zoomers who are kind of helping each other out. The millennials kind of took the hit from the dating scene, and they're kind of teaching the youth exactly where it leads, or misleads rather. But, here, I think, here we go. So one of the things, we criticized Peterson, we criticized Peter Thiel, some modern figures who were, trying to get things in a positive direction, but I think people are still not willing to go into that pre-modern territory that is still seen as blacklisted, that is still seen as too far in the past for Zoomers to relate to. But like we talked about with Elvis, there's plenty of timeless stuff that people can latch onto. But that's how you get stale media. That's how you get, it might be strange to have Anthony Fantano and Watch Mojo, but when you have people that toe a line, people that don't have real convictions, they will watch stuff like this. And I watch stuff like this. This is not to criticize everyone who ever has. Some people watch, left-leaning content that maybe didn't age well because they wanted to, look good for people that were participating in, sexual decadent culture. But the reason why you get stale media, it's not just because the politics aren't right. It's not just because we need a Tim Allen show that makes fun of Democrats instead of Republicans. The solution here is to really just kind of reorient ourselves and what kind of media we consume. And it's okay to be picky and sort of get beyond this sex positive mindset, because a lot of that stuff becomes stale real quick. And what we mentioned earlier, Tumblr for women, this is a space that I think a lot of women found a lot of friendships, a lot of culture to be relatable to them. I think it would kind of surprise a lot of people that there was a big shift after pornography was banned from the website, and you sort of had all these people exiled from the site. What does it say about the state of young people where something as innocuous as the ban of pornography is enough to get people to move into other spaces? And then you start to see this migration online into other spaces. Is that something that's sustainable, is that something that we're really satisfied with, the fact that those are the kind of outlets we see that at once start very local, wholesome, and then sometimes literally transition into something different? I think that's something a lot of people miss. But to wrap up here, to wrap up again and again, I think we got some of our last slides here. Our last example. Last week we talked about the Clash. We talked about how sort of symbolically on their first album, they talked about how, because for those that don't know, punk rock is kind of the natural progression after 50s rock and roll. Where do you take rock and roll after the 50s? I think punk was very true to a lot of those merits. And it's kind of interesting how Elvis died 77. The Clash came out with their debut album 77. It's like the new generation of the music. One of the songs was titled 1977, and he talks about, I'm paraphrasing, but he talks about no more Elvis, no more Beatles, no more Rolling Stones. It's like this is the new era. The new era of music is us. And the problem with that, and the problem with punk rock, as many people are aware of, it fizzled out. It had its peak, and then it kind of had this identity crisis. Well, what happens when you have a music identity that doesn't have roots, it doesn't have something specific to reference off of? It gets co-opted. And one of the things that happened in the CBGB scenes on the East Coast, a lot of the bands that were successful into the 80s, it wasn't punk rock bands, it was new wave bands. New wave is an identity that's malleable. It was futurist. And, we like Debbie Harry. We like the Talking Heads. It's very weird. I can't quite explain why. But it has nothing to do musically. It has to do with the fact that you had this different identity that was able to survive. And a lot of the punk bands in the 70s, they died very early on. And that's too bad, because the Dead Boys are a good example. You had bands that could easily carry the torch. But again, when you have, like the Clash we're talking about, just sort of running away from the past without any reference for what it's for. There is no backing to the philosophy, no foundation. That is where you're going to see a lot of the trends die out very early. And so that's preventable. That's something that a lot of us can avoid. And so I think we got one final slide here. I think this will probably be the most political slide for the next one. But But here, I'll wrap it up with this. The Prudentialist, who we've talked about in the past, she has a, or excuse me, the Prudentialist has this this article talking about the state of young people, the state of sort of where are Zoomers going to go after they've been saturated with so much media? Where are they going to find things like social political networks? Well, he admits there really isn't a playbook yet. There really isn't a blueprint. But instead, what we can do is recognize the media that we're consuming already, and we can find to ourselves to be a little bit more picky, and it would be helpful to adopt an elitist mindset. I know that might sound a little too exclusive. We don't want to totally, gatekeep the gatekeepers. Might sound something that is counterproductive, but as I've talked with Nigel Carlsbad, who's somebody that we cited last week, there is something consistent with a counter elite. There is something fruitful about having a Generation Z that kind of looks like a populist identity, but really what they want is just better media, better identity, and something to look back on that's going to last. Because if we stick to stuff that's modern, if we stick to stuff that is wedded to the sexual revolution and all the personalities that come with it, the third wave feminist personalities, I think a lot of that stuff is very specific and it doesn't have a lot of longevity. And so that's why we defend pre-modern eras. It's not exclusively in a political context. It's about culture. It's about a lot of the stuff that we've talked about throughout this speech. And so that's it. Generation Z, we're going to make it. We're going to find our identity, and we're going to be us unapologetically. Thank you. All right. Do we have any questions? I'm going to have to do a James Bond move to get to our online ones. What? Do you have?
No, I was going to ask if you want me to.
Oh, no. We're good on the slides over here. But I think we got some comments. All these crazy kids in the comments. I'll have to. Also, I wasn't going to remember this during the speech, so I'll just say it now. What is this? Of course, it's a username I can't pronounce, so it's going to be a little more difficult. All right. Well, we'll check. We'll verify with people in chat if there's any. We'll see if we got something to. Any content. Well, one moment, please. One moment while I go over the table. We'll verify some. I don't know if the audio is all in sync here. Subject to change. Does that come? Oh no, I'm overthinking it here. We got just Jimmy's in chat. Little or that might be yeah. I think the YouTube link might be public. I think if you go to YouTube first, that might be a little easier. But it might autocorrect. The future is zoomy, so true. Oh, okay. That's rejecting the hippie era. Yeah, that's the thing. All right. Yo, chilling. All right. Yo, echo moment. Yo, let's go. All right. I think, are we all done? Do you have it there? Oh, never mind. Oh, gotcha. All right. I think we're going to wrap up. That's our sex speech. That's our sex education speech. That's our Gen Z speech. Noise the political. Interesting. So we got some recommendations in chat. All right. Wow, surreal. Hyperculture. Talk about hyperculture. All right. We'll wrap up. That's a wrap. Yeah, there we go. We're so back. All right. That's a wrap.